Hi everyone, I'm Trish Triumpho Sullivan, and we are in Art History 1B, lecture number 2, part 3. We're going to talk about aesthetic terms today, so let's move right forward with it. Okay, so these are, we'll just change that because it's no longer historical categories. We're in aesthetic. Right? Aesthetic categories in art. All right. So the first one we're going to talk about is form. All right? Form is the shape of an object. Okay? So it's basically, and in this case, we're talking about the shape of an object or artwork. Right? And it's basically what we see. That's it. It's what we see, okay? Artists create the form using a medium or media, which is media is the plural of medium, and tools, the appropriate tools for that particular medium. So a medium in art, let me just put that down here, right? A medium describes the actual, the stuff, right, that the artist is using. So medium could be paint, right? That would be to make a painting. A medium could be stone, say to create a sculpture, or brick to build a building, or metal, right? That could be the medium to create something. And then the tools that they use to do that would be, say, if it's a painting, it would be a brush, a paintbrush, right? If it's a stone sculpture, it might be a chisel, okay, and hammer. So these are the kind of things that they would use with the medium, or the plural, right, is media. Okay, so the form is the shape of an object, what we see, right? Next, we're going to say technique. Another term that we want to know. It's the technical process that the artist employs using their media and their tools, right? So that's the technical process. So how they do it, what's that process? In painting, it's the actual art of painting, right? In sculpture, it would, could be a number of different things. Wood carving, it could mean, stone, working stone. It could be welding with metal, right? That could be the process. So that's the technical process. The technique is the process, the technical process. Right? So the next word is space. The final frontier. But that's only if you're Star Trek fans, right? So space is the bounded, or the boundaries, the container, we'll say container of objects. So it's the we'll say the boundary or boundless. Container of objects. Okay, so the boundary or boundless container, we're saying it. So in architecture, we see an obvious manipulation of space, right? Because we've got a building with a shell that encloses space inside of it. In painting, we see more of an illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, right? Because we know a painting is flat, right? And it only has this much space, or whatever space is there. So if it looks like it's three-dimensional, it's an illusion. And so that's creating this sense of space in this two-dimensional painting, right? So space is kind of either a boundary or boundless area, right? It's kind of the space surrounding us. If I'm sitting in this room, I've got space surrounding me, but then the room is bounded by walls, right? So there's this limited space in a room. Got it? All right, so next we have area or plane. And area or plane kind of relates to this space thing. So I'm going to leave the space up here for a sec. So we've probably heard that term picture plane at some point if you've been doing any art. So the area or plane is a two-dimensional space. I'm going to have to change my writing utensils here, it looks like. So it's a two-dimensional space, usually referred to as a surface. Okay, and a plane is flat. So we've got so this board I'm writing on would be like a plane, right? It's flat, and it's a two-dimensional area. Okay, an area is a plane or a surface that is bounded. Okay, often by a frame. So here we've got a frame. So this is an area that's bounded by a frame, right? So it's flat, so it is a plane, okay? But it's not an infinite plane, right? It's bounded, it has a boundary. So this is an area, this is my whiteboard area, right? So that's an area or a plane. And so it's a two-dimensional space. A plane is a two-dimensional space and of any size, and an area is a two-dimensional space bounded by a frame. That makes sense to everybody. So mass and volume. So let's talk about this. These are kind of big deals in art and pretty important to know about. Okay, so we've got mass and volume. All right. So mass, we use mass and volume to describe a three-dimensional space. As in, say, a sculpture or architecture, okay? Mass is the bulk. We'll say the bulk, density, whoops, shoot, that didn't work, huh? And weight, okay? Of matter in space. Okay. Mass need not be solid though, right? So think about the exterior of a building, for example, has mass, right? Although it encloses open space as well, right? So it's hollow inside. So mass can apply to, a solid pyramid, right? As well as a cathedral that is huge, but has also huge volumes of open space inside. So it's basically hollow. It's a shell enclosing a large space. So mass does not necessarily have to be solid. Okay, it could be something that has an open interior. Okay, so volume is the space that is organized or enclosed by mass. Okay, it could be spaces inside a building, right? Like a room inside a building, or the amount of space, say, occupied by a sculpture. Okay, volume can describe the interior and exterior of a work of art. In sculpture, we often use the terms open and closed. To talk about how the work is made. So a closed sculpture is something where nothing is sticking out, right? So they've got everything is tight. So if I'm doing a sculpture of a person, everything is tight on that person, right? And an open sculpture is something where things are sticking out, right? So if I was making a sculpture of myself and my arms are sticking out, that would be an open form. So we've got an open form and a closed form. And volume is often used to describe how the mass of the artwork, that bulk, right, the bulk or density or weight of the artwork interacts with the space around it, or the volume of both, right? The interior space. If it's an open sculpture, there might be interior volume as well. So, for instance, if my arm is like this, there's volume in here. Okay, even though it's a sculpture, if I was a sculpture, this area would have volume. There would be open space there. So volume. Volume is basically how the space is organized or divided and enclosed or enclosed by mass. Okay, so these work together. So it's just how the space is organized or enclosed. So mass and volume, very important. We've got the bulk, density, weight of matter in space, and volume is how that space is organized or enclosed. So that can, relate more to, we tend to think of it more for architecture than we do for sculpture. And of course, for 2 dimensions, it doesn't really quite make a difference on that. So mass and volume, very, very important. Right, so next we have line. And line is one of those things. We talk about line a lot in art. It's one of the most important and sometimes most difficult concepts to understand in art. It is defined in both science and art as the path of a point moving in space. So there's a point and there's the path of a point moving in space, right? And the quality of a line can be various and subtle, because motions and directions are almost infinite, right? We can do almost anything with that. Line direction can elicit a wide variety of psychological responses in us. For instance, they think of a vertical line as being active, a horizontal line as being passive, and a diagonal line is implying motion. Okay, and so these are things that we mostly subconscious. Okay, so this is something that we don't think about, but artists make use of line in art quite a bit. So a serpentine line, right, or an S-curve, is thought to be graceful and beautiful, right? There are different kinds of lines, right? So we've got a solid line like this. We can have a dashed line, right? It could be a bold line or a soft line, right? Very soft. It could be an implied line, like in other words, the difference of 2 colors. For instance, if we had, say I had a color like this in an artwork and a color like this, right? Where those 2 colors meet is an implied line, right? There's not really a line drawn there, but there's a implied line. So line is really important in art, and we're going to be talking about it quite a bit. So this is something you want to kind of remember. Next, we have perspective. And perspective, let's see, let me write it down. And perspective is really an integral part in our studies in art history. It is one of the most important, I'm going to say, discoveries, right, or inventions of the Italian Renaissance. And there are three basic types of perspective. There's linear, atmospheric, and intellectual. And they all create an illusion of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane or area. So they create this illusion of there's three dimensions on a two-dimensional plane or area, right? So perspective, three dimensions on a two-dimensional plane or area. Right. In the Italian Renaissance, they perfected, the 1-point perspective, and then we got into 2-point perspective, and etc. And that's linear perspective. So we're talking mostly in the Renaissance about linear perspective. But there's three different kinds of linear perspective too. There's 1-point. So in linear perspective, you've got 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective, okay? And let's just talk briefly about these three different kinds of perspective, okay? So we've got linear perspective. This is what we're talking about, three-dimensional on a two-dimensional plane. We've got atmospheric. And we've got intellectual. Intellectual perspective. So it's three different types of perspective. So 1-point perspective is something like this. You've got a picture plane, that's the horizon line, there's a point in the middle, and everything disappears into that point. So things in the front seem larger, right? So here I might have, like, say I have a railroad track. So they seem larger here, and then as we get going further back, they go together and they're small, right? So that's kind of disappearing into this 1 point on the horizon line. And that's 1-point perspective. And it works. It makes it feel like things in front are larger. So we've got kind of like a tree here, but if we had a tree back here, it might be small and smaller and smaller until, right, it goes back into nothing, right? We can't see it anymore. So 2-point perspective is where you have 2 points on the horizon line. So if I'm going to do 2-point perspective, I'm going to have a horizon line and I have 2 points, and we've got these kind of lines radiating off that are guidelines that the artist works with. So if I was going to use 2-point perspective to say paint or draw a box, right, or a building, I would use these lines coming off of the point as my guidelines. So I could let me use a different color here so you can see what I'm doing. So I would use these lines. There's the top, right? Come down here, and then here's the bottom. Right, so then I erase these other lines, and I've got what looks like a three-dimensional building or box, right? And 3-point perspective goes even a little further. So 3-point perspective we have horizon line, right? And then we also have another point, either up or down, and the lines coming off of these can make, and this is rarely used, this is that either bird's eye or worm's eye view. But what it basically means is you've got another set of lines coming up that you're using, or coming down, however, to describe this shape, this building or box or whatever it is. And so if I was looking down on it, it might have more this kind of a look of using these as well, these lines as well, right? To make it look like I'm looking down on something from up high, or opposite, I'd be looking up from down low. So that's 3-point. That's linear perspective. So there's the 3 types of linear perspective: 1, 2, and 3-point perspective, okay? Atmospheric perspective is a little different. Atmospheric perspective is where we have the interference of the atmosphere. And the atmosphere, and this is used in art a lot, you guys, when you look at something very far away, we have, the sky is blue. The sky is blue because our gases in our atmosphere refract the blue light in the spectrum, right? The ultraviolet light, right? So the ultraviolet light's refracted in our atmosphere, and so it's bouncing all over the place, and that's what makes our sky blue, right? That's what makes the sky look blue, is because we actually have light bouncing around in the gases in our atmosphere, and that's what makes it blue. The reason the ocean appears blue, or water appears blue, is because it's reflecting the sky, right? Water reflects. The atmosphere doesn't reflect stuff, right? The atmosphere is just gas, right? We can't see it. So we see this, what we see is the light bouncing around all over the atmosphere. And what that does is when we see something really far away, so if we have, here's the Earth, and we got some mountains over here, and we've got a person over here. Yep. Let me do it like this. Right? And the person over here is seeing these mountains way far away across the horizon line. They're seeing it through a whole lot of blue atmosphere. And because of that, things in the far distance often appear to be this kind of a bluish, or even violet kind of a color, like a little purplish, like Purple Mountain's Majesty, right? So when you see something far away, it not only looks faded, but it looks blue. And is the mountain really blue when you get up close to it? No, it's not blue. It's whatever color, grass or trees or rocks or dirt that's on it, right? But from far away, it looks blue because of the interference of our atmosphere, and that's why it's called atmospheric perspective, okay? And the final one is intellectual perspective. An intellectual perspective, you guys, is basically what our brain tells us. So if we see 3 objects represented like this, which one would you say is the closest to us? Right. The triangle. The furthest away, the square. Why is that? Because they're overlapping, and our brain, our intellect, right, tells us that if something is overlapping something else, that thing is closer than that thing. And then the thing that's being overlapped by both of them is the furthest away, right? And that's also true with scale and proportion, and we're going to talk about that's part of the intellectual perspective. Scale and proportion, we often think of the largest thing as being closest, right? And also where it is on the picture plane. Something down low we tend to think is closer, something up high we tend to think is further away, and that is still intellectual perspective, because that's our brain that has a whole lifetime of experience looking at things, right? And interpreting and perceiving tells us that is the way it is, right? So artists use all of these in perspective to make to create art and to make us have this feeling of 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional space. Right, so perspective, very, very important. Okay, and then now we have proportion. Right, proportion proportion. That describes the size relationships of the parts of an artwork, okay? The idea and recognition of proportion is really easy for us. It's easy for us to recognize. We don't need a ruler to see when features are out of proportion, such as features of a human face or the human body. So if I was drawing a face and, you know, we made the eyes, whoops. We made the mouth, we'll put the mouth in first, right? We made the nose, and then we made the eyes, right? We would recognize immediately that those are out of proportion. They're way bigger than they should be on a person's head, right? You know, for that size of a head, the eyes should be more like this size. Right? That looks more in proportion. So our brain, this is also an intellectual thing, our brain from, you know, a lifetime experience tells us when stuff is out of proportion. And so formalized proportion is kind of a mathematical relationship of one part of an artwork to the other parts of the same artwork, okay? And it's been found that some artists may have actually used harmonic ratios found in music to create art, right? Da Vinci is one of those artists. The ancient Greeks considered beauty to be correct proportion, right? So they said, you know, if they thought beauty meant correct proportion. Right, that's the ancient Greeks thought that was correct. And they used what they called a canon. And a canon is a rule, right? A canon or a rule, right? So these mean the same thing, okay, of proportion. And these canons or rules change through time and between cultures, so they don't always stay the same. And remember that artists sometimes use disproportion on purpose, right? They use it deliberately. And proportional relationships are often based on a module, okay, or we call a basic unit of measurement. So that all the parts, especially in architecture, are multiples or fractions of that module or basic unit. So let's write that down. And you'll find this is true in a lot of architecture and art. So in other words, if I was building something and I had everything was, my module was 2 feet. Let's say we have 2 feet there. Then everything in that building is either a multiple of that 2 feet, right? Or a fraction of the 2 feet. Right? So it could be, right? So that would be just everything is based on that one size thing. And next I want to talk about scale, because scale is related to proportion as well. So let's talk about scale. So scale refers to dimensional relationships too, okay? And usually it's an artwork's relationship to its surroundings or environment, okay? And in terms of appropriateness or function, right? So this is the relationship to the surroundings or environment. So relationship to the environment, and also the appropriateness of is it appropriate? function, or function or appropriateness just in general. For instance, like we don't try to house a giraffe in our living room, right? It's too big of a scale to fit in our small scale living room, right? Nor would we want to have a stadium, like a sports stadium, as a doghouse, right? It's too big for the dog. The dog might enjoy it, but it's too big for the dog. So often we use the human form to give scale. And just a quick note on scale that brings it to our local area here, you guys. We have that Hatton 3 Stages of Landing sculpture in Sherwood Park, right, by the rodeo grounds. And that is what they call a large scale sculpture, right? The scale is large because the hat is, a hat isn't normally that big, right? A hat would normally be something I'd hold in my hands. But those hat sculptures, or that hat sculpture, they're like 9 feet across, right? So the scale is very large compared to what a hat would normally be to fit on a human head, right? And therefore it has this interesting relationship to the environment around it, right? So the scale is very different, and we'll talk about that more. So scale, it's referring to a dimensional relationship, usually the relationship to the environment or surroundings, but it could be to another part of the artwork as well, okay? And also in terms of appropriateness or function, like is it appropriate, does it or the function is different. So next lecture, I'm gonna finish up talking about light, and that's going to take a whole lecture, because light is one of the most important things that we use in art. In fact, we need it to see, right? Our perception of sight depends on light, because we can't see in a dark room, right? If it's completely dark, we can't see anything. We need light to see, and we need light to see color, because color is a property of light, not of matter. And we'll talk about that in our next lecture.